There's something hard to explain about what happened in movie theaters around the world during the first months of 1998. It wasn't the opening of a new film. It was the same film. The same one people had already seen the week before, or the month before. There were people buying their second ticket, their third, their fourth. Not because they'd forgotten the ending, but precisely because they remembered it. A dark theater, a ship that sinks, a love story that ends badly, and still people came back. That pattern, which made no obvious sense from a market standpoint, was one of the clearest signs that Titanic wasn't simply a successful movie. It was something else. It was an event. To understand what that means in terms of box office, you first have to untangle a few concepts that tend to blur together whenever records come up. Nominal gross is the most commonly cited figure. How many dollars a film generated over its commercial run? But that number alone doesn't say much without knowing when the film was made and released, how much a ticket cost at the time, how many countries it reached, and whether re-releases added revenue decades later. A film from the 1940s, when tickets cost a few cents, might have sold more admissions than any modern blockbuster, and still rank lower on the nominal charts. When you adjust for inflation or count tickets sold, the picture shifts completely. What Gone with the Wind does in those alternative calculations still challenges nearly everything that came after it. Box office records aren't absolute truths. They're answers to specific questions, and the question you ask determines who ends up on top. With that in mind, what Titanic accomplished in 1997 and 1998 was extraordinary by almost any reasonable measure. James Cameron arrived at the project with a reputation built on films that combined spectacle, narrative tension, and technical ambition. The Terminator, Aliens, The Abyss, True Lies. Each one had pushed something forward. The action genre, visual effects, shooting in extreme conditions. But Titanic was different in scale and in nature. It was a real historical tragedy, transformed into an epic melodrama. It was a bet of more than $200 million at a time when that budget was enough to cause genuine panic in any Hollywood studio. And that panic was real. Press coverage in the months before release described a troubled production, delays, runaway costs, and serious doubts about whether audiences would pay to watch a ship they already knew was going to sink. The studios behind it, Paramount and 20th Century Fox, had invested heavily and were nervous. Cameron, who held creative control over the production, pushed forward. That tension between industrial risk and artistic conviction is part of what makes Titanic such a compelling case study, not just as a movie, but as a moment in the industry. What Cameron built was a deliberately layered emotional structure. The historical reconstruction gave the film credibility and visual weight. The romance between characters from opposite social classes provided an emotional core accessible to audiences across cultures. The visual effects, which combined scale models, practical filming on a ship built in Mexico, and digital technology that was still being developed at the time, created an overwhelming sense of physical reality. Celine Dion's music wasn't a commercial afterthought. It was part of a deliberate strategy of emotional resonance that worked on a global scale. The image of the ship tilting and breaking apart became one of the defining images of cinema in that decade. All of those elements didn't operate in isolation. They worked together, and together they produced something audiences wanted to experience again. Titanic's success wasn't built on a single massive opening weekend. It was built on endurance. Weeks in theaters that kept accumulating. Viewers who dragged partners, mothers, friends who hadn't seen it yet. Word of mouth acted as an amplifier for months. The film ultimately crossed $600 million in North America alone, and more than $1,800 million worldwide, figures that had no real precedent at the time. Hollywood finished processing something it had already suspected. International markets could multiply the scale of a hit in ways that the domestic market alone never could. That lesson stayed with the industry. The coordination of global release dates, marketing campaigns designed for multiple cultures simultaneously, films built to land emotionally beyond any single language. All of it accelerated after Titanic. Not because Cameron invented those ideas, but because the numbers proved what was possible. 12 years later, Cameron returned with Avatar. The film world had changed dramatically in that time. Digital projectors had replaced film in a growing share of theaters worldwide. 3D, which had existed in awkward and imperfect versions since the 1950s, was being relaunched with new technology that promised a sharper, less exhausting experience. And international markets had grown even stronger. China, in particular, was becoming a decisive factor in global records. Avatar bet on something specific. The theater as a place that offered something home viewing simply couldn't replicate. It wasn't just a story. It was a world. Pandora, the planet Cameron and his team spent years designing, was built with a visual density and internal consistency that demanded a large screen. Motion capture, a technique that had already been explored by Robert Zemeckis in films like The Polar Express, reached an unprecedented scale and resolution in Avatar. Actors moved through completely empty environments with sensors on their bodies, and those movements were translated and completed by teams of digital artists who built, frame by frame, creatures and landscapes that existed nowhere in the physical world. The technical result was overwhelming for many audiences in 2009. The combination of well-executed 3D with a world specifically designed to take advantage of that dimensionality created a sense of presence that home cinema of that era simply couldn't offer. Avatar sold the theater as a destination, not as a place to watch a story, but as the only place where that story could be fully experienced. The numbers that followed surpassed Titanic in nominal gross. Avatar reached $2.7 billion, a figure that seemed untouchable for years. Part of that total included planned re-releases in various markets, which added revenue gradually over time. The industry understood that a well-timed re-release, especially during a period without strong competition, could add hundreds of millions to a film that had already closed its original run. When Avengers: Endgame briefly overtook Avatar in 2019, it produced one of the strangest moments in modern box office history. Two films competing in real time for the top spot, with studios and fans tracking the weekly numbers as if it were a sporting event. Avatar reclaimed the record through a strategic re-release in China. That episode revealed something important about the nature of modern records. They aren't just the passive result of a film's success. They're also the result of active decisions around distribution, re-releases, and targeted markets where relaunching a film can have a decisive effect. Avatar: The Way of Water, released in 2022, confirmed that the immersive experience model still held. It was one of the most expensive productions in history and needed enormous returns just to be considered profitable. It got there, though it took long enough to make the industry nervous for weeks. It finished among the 5 highest-grossing films ever made. It proved that the universe Cameron had built was still capable of drawing millions of people to theaters, even at a moment when streaming had fundamentally reorganized how audiences consumed film. The story behind these records isn't just James Cameron's story. It's the story of crews of hundreds who built worlds and technologies, of distributors who coordinated simultaneous releases across dozens of countries, of theaters that invested in premium formats to offer something a home screen couldn't match, of musicians and designers and programmers who spent years on projects whose scale pushed against the limits of what was technically possible. And it's the story of millions of people who chose, voluntarily, to spend time and money on an experience they could already anticipate, or had already lived once before. Somewhere in the archives of some theater from 1998, there's probably a record of the same ticket sold 3 times to the same person for the same film. Not because the ending was a surprise, but because there was something in that room, on that large screen, in that music, and in that image of a ship slowly disappearing into the Atlantic, that needed to be lived with other people. That feeling, multiplied by millions across dozens of countries, is what turned Titanic into a record. And that same impulse, renewed with different technology and a different imagined world, explains what Avatar built a decade later. The numbers are the trace left behind. What produced them was something else entirely.